Today I'm going to make the rack for the Scrabble tiles. This is the first one I made. I like the way it came out, so I'm going to use it as a pattern. This one was made from one solid piece out of a log. I don't have that luxury anymore, so I'm going to have to cut this in 2 strips and glue them together to make that shape. So I trimmed the sides off, ready to cut the strips now. I'm going to use this as a pattern, so I'm going to just set my fence to the same width it is. That's going to be one of my pieces. So that was the back. Now I'm going to measure for the bottom by setting it like that. And again, use my pattern to see how much to take off this way. I have taped them together temporarily. This is the way it's going to go, like that. You'll notice that where these two come together, the grain is quite a bit different. That's because one board was going this way and the other one was going the other way. They're right angles to each other. That's why I chose to make the seam on the bottom where it won't show as much. The other seam will be inside that hollowed out place, so hopefully neither one will be very obvious where the two come together. Now I'm going to just use this to draw a pattern on the end of the boards. So hopefully you can see the pattern I've drawn on there. That's what I'm going to cut away. But I'm going to take these back apart and cut them individually before I glue them, because they're easier that way. I'll cut this one with the table saw and do this over on the router table. For this cut, I measured that angle with a protractor and tilted my saw blade accordingly. But I don't really trust myself, so I'm going to make a shallow cut first and see how it looks, and then I'll make the real cut. I'm going to take this cut out next with using a round nose router bit, and I'll move it around a little bit till I get most of that out. I won't be able to get exactly that curve, but most of it. Then I'll do this part with a different router bit. So you can see that's a good start. I'm just going to raise it up a little bit now and move it back and forth till I get most of that out. So I got a pretty good cut there. I'll have to clean up this part. It's really rough, but I cleaned it up with chisel and sandpaper. Now I'm ready to cut this curve, and I'll do it twice, each side with a round over bit like that. And there you go. Looks pretty good. So there it is, ready to be glued together now. I'm going to put some dowels in here to help stabilize it. I probably don't need them. This is a pretty wide surface to glue, but just to be sure, I'm going to drill some holes and put dowels in to really cement that joint. I've drilled 2 holes that the dowels will go into, and their location is just kind of random, but now it's very important that I drill these holes to exactly match those, and to do that I have these little things right here that fit in these holes to mark the next holes. So I just put those in there like so, and pick that up like I want it, and then I bring the other one where I want to match up, and then just press them together, and those points will mark where the next hole goes. So it made marks for the next holes to be drilled. So I'm ready to glue. Well, I had a little trouble. The dowels were actually too long, so I had to take it back apart, cut the towels off, and put it back together. But now it's all together. Just gotta let the glue dry. So here's the rack. Still got a lot of sanding to do. Turned out pretty good. Now I'm ready to do the tiles. I've got to first of all plane this down to about that thickness. So I have my board all planed now to the right thickness, and I've marked off the squares for the letters. I'm going to carve all the letters first before I cut them apart. It's easier that way. And I've lined it out so that this is the 0, 0, X, Y for this square, and so on and so forth. Down here, the edge of the board is going to be the 0 axis for Y, and the line is the X. And so the computer program goes from that as the starting point. As long as I line it up exactly on those points, they should all look the same, we hope. So I'm all set up here. My board's all bolted down tight. Here's my router, and my computer's all ready to carve the P. While the router is doing its thing, I have nothing else to do but watch it, so I've been working on the tray using the chisel to kind of carve out the rough parts. And when I get that fairly smooth, I will go back and go over it with sandpaper to get it totally smooth. So there are the letters. They're all carved out. I put masking tape around them to kind of form a dam for the epoxy, so it doesn't, at least it stays one tape thickness above the surface of the board. So I'm now going to spray it with polyurethane so that the epoxy doesn't bleed into the wood, kind of seals it, and then it'll be ready for the epoxy. I've measured out with my scale the epoxy and the hardener 2 parts to 1, and I'm ready to mix those together. And I let the epoxy sit for a while, make sure it's reacting before I add the paint. I can tell it's reacting because it's getting warm, so I'm ready to add the paint. I just add 3 or 4 drops of acrylic paint, black, I stir that really well. And I make sure I get all the cracks, all the openings covered. The epoxy is all set up now and hard, so I'm going to go and sand that down, back down to the bare wood. I'm going to start out over here on the belt sander to get most of it off. I'm going to finish it up with my orbital sander. So there it is, all cleaned off. The letters came out looking really nice. So I'm ready to cut them apart now. I have drawn lines for cutting. There are two things that are very important. One is that the letters themselves are the same orientation, same height in the within the tiles, and that the tiles themselves are the same size. In order to make sure that these letters all line up with each other, I've measured with a caliper the distance to the bottom of that one, and then drawn a line the same distance here. But just to be sure, I'm going to cut just below that line. You notice I have some excess. I'm going to cut just below that line and then move in slowly until I get exactly the right distance, the same distance between here and here as between here and here. Now I'm going to cut off the excess at the top, and I've got it set for one. I'll run it through, and then I'll run the other one through at exactly the same distance, so that makes sure they'll be exactly the same height for all tiles. So the tiles are going to be exactly the same height now, because that was the same for both strips. Then I'll do something similar with these lines. These are the critical lines, and the excess, other is just excess. So I'll cut the critical lines first, and then make sure that they're all exactly the same width, similar to this. The horizontal lines aren't quite as critical because the letters themselves are different widths, and also they're not going to be stacked on top of each other, so you're not going to be able to tell if they're not exactly lined up horizontally. So I'm just going to eyeball the first line and then come back and make sure they're the same width. I have cut one tile to the size I want, and I put a stop block there. So all I got to do now is cut the others. They'll all, because of the stop block, they'll all be exactly the same width. My next step now is to reduce those sharp edges by taking my small round over bit, and I'll just cut those edges and soften them up so they're nice and round and even. Just one more thing to do now. I'm going to take these sharp corners off with my sander. that's pretty much it now. I just have to do some hand sanding to clean it up, and it'll be ready for the finish. Well, it's all done, all ready for the finish to go on, except for the S. I had to redo the S, put some more epoxy on it. But all the rest are ready to go, and I'm going to start finishing those.